Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of the Daily Run, and today we're playing as Kane. So today's Daily Run is going to Mega Satan again, and this is something that I kind of pointed out not too long ago, but a lot of the Mega Satan dailies do feel very cumbersome and maybe not that fun. But this particular daily actually was, I think, very fair. It was one of the most fair runs we've had in a really long time, just basically giving you every single tool that you need. You have enough defense, you have enough offense, but at the same time it wasn't too strong or too weak, and it was just kind of, I would say, right in the middle. You still had to be very careful not to take too much damage, especially against some of those harder rooms later on, but still, it never felt like it was an insurmountable challenge, and whenever you actually got out of the room, when you kind of had to work a little bit, it felt very satisfying. So I guess what I wanted to say is, it's one of those runs that you finish it and you're just gonna glad to have played it, because you know that you had to make some decisions, you had to play well if you actually wanted to get to the end, and that's exactly the feeling I had at the end. So when I finished the run, I picked up the trophy, I looked at my damage penalty, and I felt, you know, actually for the situation that we were in, I feel like I played relatively well, and I'm really happy to have finished the run and get over 50,000 points. Even though maybe in majority of cases you're kinda gunning for a little bit more on a Mega Satan daily, in this particular one, it just felt, like I said, very satisfying to actually get to that point. Maybe one thing I didn't want to mention, like the only thing that really didn't sit right with me, is the low speed. And the low speed is one of those things which I think kind of gets brought up often, and especially the problem is if you don't have enough speed, so if it's below a certain threshold, a certain attacks or enemies are just gonna basically be inevitable damage. I think the prime example or the prime offender of this is the Harsher's Tornado, because it's gonna chase you down if you don't have something like 1.3 speed, and if you don't start running early enough, it's gonna catch you and it's gonna deal damage to you. And the other problem is, once it catches to you, it's still gonna be on you for like the remaining 5 or 3 seconds, 3 to 5 seconds or 5 to 3 seconds, which means that you're gonna not only gonna get hit once, but maybe twice or maybe even 3 times. So is there really anything we can do about it? And of course, the answer is no, because you really can't inflate your speed, and maybe the only other being or maybe choice is that you stay on the other side of the room and really try to be just as far as possible and kind of maximize the distance between you and Harsh. But the problem is, if you don't have enough range, like for example Kane doesn't, then you're still forced to stand right next to Harsh if you actually want to deal damage. In this particular case, that's not that big of a problem because we have Bumbo to deal damage remotely, but in a lot of other cases it wouldn't be. So it kind of led me to think, so is the speed stat actually even a good stat? Is it a stat that should be in the game? Because when you think about it, if you don't have enough speed, you're kind of guaranteed to make damage. And if you have too much speed, then you're kind of guaranteed to take, again, too much damage, because you're going to have too much velocity, you're going to kind of run into spikes and things like that. So I was thinking, is there basically any reason for speed to exist in the game in the current form? And I don't think there is, actually. I think the speed is one of those redundant stats. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be items which affect speed, but I think that speed in itself is a stat that shouldn't exist. Because first of all, it makes balancing much harder. Because then, of course, when you're trying to make new rooms, if you just have one base speed you have to balance around, then that becomes a much easier job as opposed to having to keep in mind that maybe someone approaches this room with 0.7 speed and maybe someone approaches this room in 2 speed. So for example, there are a lot of spike rooms, and they are either made impossible or very trivial depending on how much speed you have, and of course you never really can control how much speed you're gonna have in a particular room or position, which leads you to kind of be at the mercy of the game, and it never feels good, right? Because when you do pick up a speed stat or a speed downgrade or a speed upgrade, sure, you know, it's a speed upgrade, maybe, you know, it helps you a little bit, it kind of helps you to dodge, I guess, but it never really feels like you're getting a substantial increase, it never feels like you're getting stronger. So I feel like in the majority of cases, it would just be better if it were kind of locked to, for example, a 1.5 speed, and that was like our baseline. So in the majority of the runs, you really couldn't go beyond that. Now, I'm not saying, like I said before, that there shouldn't be items which affect speed. Like for example, I think an item like Lard is a good item, like in that regard, because you're kind of balancing it out, because you're getting a lot of health, but of course you're reducing your speed in a return, so it's more, I would say, of a balanced risky proposition. But in the world where maybe you didn't have enough speed, or maybe you were capped at 1.5, you would have to take it, and knowing you take it, I think first of all it would create a much larger risk and a much larger decision making. I still don't think you would take it in the majority of cases, like you don't take it in this particular instance, but when you were forced to take it, or maybe when you had the run that revolved around it, you would pick it up with that in mind, and I feel like maybe that would make it a little bit more interactive and the decision a little bit more meaningful. In the same vein, I think the items which increase speed shouldn't really increase speed. Like, for example, the spoon doesn't really work in that regard, but I think something like Roid Rage does still have place in the game, because it would increase your speed and of course your range. It would be one of those rare items which I think should increase the speed just by the virtue of existing. But some of the other items which only serve to increase speed, I don't think should really affect it. And for example, there's also, I think, Poison Touch, which reduces speed. I would definitely remove that because I don't see the point of that. Also Matt's Kitten Stone and just some other random items which I think affect the speed stat, and they really have no right to do it. And of course, when you think about it in that sense, if there was like a base speed which you can expect to have for the majority of the run, and of course there weren't speed down and speed up those, I feel like it would make the game a lot more consistent. At least it would make it feel a lot more consistent, because really the speed is one of those stats which you don't notice until you need it, and when that happens it usually feels pretty bad. So I don't know really if this is a feasible strategy or even a feasible idea to kind of go around, but I definitely think there's something on there. Like, for example, every single other stat has a meaningful difference when you actually pick it up. For example, luck might be a bit of a passive stat, or maybe even a bit of a hidden stat, but it still feels good when you pick it, because you know your chances of getting items increase. And I think speed kind of works in the same vein, that it's a bit of a hidden stat, and like I said, you don't really notice it until you actually need it, but it feels maybe just that it should be a little bit more snappy. And I think this is one of those things which, again, the game mechanics get tied to stats. Like, for example, I think I mentioned that with one of the new items, which is the fast bomb, so how fast you can actually drop the bombs on the ground. And I feel like to some extent, you know, it's a novel idea. It's definitely something that I think is worth exploring, but I don't think really it has a place in the game, and I feel like it would feel a little bit more consistent. But then again, Isaac isn't really a game about consistency, you know. It's kind of designed around the way that sometimes you're gonna have a run which is gonna feel really bad, and not only is gonna be very unfun to play. Of course, there's always an option to restart the run, so you know, there's really no, I would say, pain or pleasure there. So if you ever feel like a run is too much for you and if you don't really care about the streak, you can just restart it and kind of go alongside that, and you know, no harm done, because whenever you play a new Isaac daily or a new Isaac run, it's basically a self-contained experience, so you don't and never have to experience some of those downloads if you don't really enjoy them, or if you don't kind of, I would say, push for your challenge. But you know, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, and especially if someone makes like a rebalance mod or maybe an exploration mod which tries to, I would say, maybe rebalance the game to make it, I would say, a little bit more enjoyable. It's definitely one of the avenues which I think would be valuable to explore, just because it would make it that maybe, you know, maybe speed doesn't have that big of an impact on the game, and if it does, you know, I think that would be reflected nice if you actually had the chance to test it out after maybe the community has played several hundred games, and then of course maybe everybody could chime in with their opinion, and then maybe something can happen from there. This is something I've been thinking about for actually quite a bit of time, so I mean, just kind of wondering if anybody actually got to this point. Do you think there would be an interest in actually creating like a mod, which is not really a mod, but more like changing the base game mechanics? For example, buffing some very underpowered items, or maybe changing some of those guaranteed damage rooms, and just basically some quality of life tweaks, and just make, I would say, like a massive compilation mod, which kind of strives to improve some of the things that the community finds annoying. And I feel like, you know, to a certain extent, that could be a good task, but at the same time, I imagine it could be very difficult, because kind of getting all of those little things right, of course, you have to think about the time investment and how many people would actually have to kind of join on the project to kind of fix all of the different aspects, for example, room layouts, item generation, and maybe even how the scoring system works to some extent. And I feel like if like people got together and, you know, there was like a whole community-backed project behind it, I think we can really make something happen. And maybe, you know, if nothing else, it would be a nice experience just to see that some of the mechanics that are in the game, if they have a place to be, and maybe gain some new appreciation for them, or maybe in some regard, maybe we figure out something new, or maybe something better, and then of course we can just stick that in the mod. And of course, because it's a mod, it's optional, and if you want to use it, you could. So this is just an idea I had, so if anybody wants to support it, or maybe even kind of, I would say, kickstart it to some extent, I would definitely be willing to help and just kind of go in that direction. So if anybody's thinking, you know, has some coding experience, or maybe just has some ideas they want to chime in, and I think that this is a good place to put it, because, you know, this episode has me kind of talking about some of the redundant stats, or maybe, you know, the potential redundant stats that exist in Isaac, and if there are some ways to maybe address them, or maybe fix them, or maybe even change them, so we can see, you know, what would happen if the mechanics or underlying mechanics of the game would have worked differently. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed our little talk, and I hope to see you next time.